In 2016, French-Colombian academic Carlos Moreno proposed the idea of a 15-minute city where we can reach most daily activities within a short commute from home. The pandemic has seen this concept escalate in significance. The ambition now is to transition our major urban centres to 10 or even 5-minute cities. Dr. Tony Matthews joins us now, Senior Lecturer of Urban and Environmental Planning at Griffith University. Tony, so good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us today. Now, tell us about the key factors that are required to transition the big cities around the world into these much more efficient clusters.
Sure. Yeah. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, Oriel. The main thing is to try and reduce the scope of urban activity down to a smaller area. So one of the big principles of the 15-minute city, or the 10-minute city, as it's sometimes even referred to, is really to reduce the amount of time that anybody spends in their car trying to access essential services. So the idea is, at least at the highest level, that you would have all of the major services that you might need in a standard day within a 15-minute reach of where you live, ideally by walking or by cycling. And so it's kind of a reversion to a more neighborhood model. So the idea is that everybody has all of the core services within their neighborhood. The big trouble historically has always been getting enough employment into neighborhoods, but working from home has changed that a bit now. So it is more of a possibility now for cities to spatially reorganize because of the external changes in work patterns.
This kind of reorganisation, though, that you're talking about, it's a massive undertaking for governments, for councils. Is it really feasible in the world we live in today?
Well, anything's feasible with the right amount of willpower and expenditure. One of the major barriers that actually affects this transition towards this idea of a 15-minute city is the urban form and the patterns that you're already inheriting. So, for example, where you have very high levels of density, like some European cities or some Asian cities, you have the critical mass of people to justify the services and minimize the commuting. But when you have more dispersed places like, say, Australia or New Zealand and the Asia Pacific, where it's a much more suburban-based, car-dependent lifestyle, your scope for shifting to the 15-minute city is spatially you have a smaller spatial scope for shifting because you're dealing with much larger spaces and much smaller populations, and you're also dealing with a much more strongly embedded culture which is used to driving cars and going to outer suburban areas and not necessarily having things close by and not necessarily wanting things close by. So there's the physical change and there's the financial and legal and institutional cost of that, and then there's the behavior change with the public, and they may or may not want to go along with you.
So to get this moving and to get this moving in cities around the world, surely this needs to be a staged process. It can't all happen at the same time. Is that fair?
Oh, I think that's fair. Yeah, I mean, it's far too big of a reorganization to try at one time, and in a sense, we've been chipping away at this anyway, even if we haven't sort of been consciously chipping away at it. What I mean to say is that there has been a significant reversion towards inner urban living in many cities. Living in the inner city is much more popular than it used to be. Densities are not as off-putting to people as they used to be. Having a more localized lifestyle where you trade a car for local services is a much more standard thing for many people now. And many cities across the Asia Pacific have got much better at then coming along and putting in the social infrastructure that's required to support those new and expanding populations. And by that I mean things like schools and public parks and health facilities and so on. So we've kind of been doing this anyway in order to try and stop endless suburban expansion and endless expansion of cities into wilderness particularly. But to sort of reconceptualize it under the 15-minute city banner is just another way of kind of approaching issues we've already been attending to, or it's a tighter way to organize them under a singular vision. But we're sort of halfway on the way, and then the working from home thing with COVID as well was a big game changer. So I would say we're very well primed now to keep the momentum going in many cities if we wish to.
So as I mentioned in the intro, 15-minute cities is one thing, but we're now also talking about 5-minute cities and 10-minute cities. Now, surely to make a 5-minute or a 10-minute city work, it would mean high-density living. And how much does this then compromise the livability of wherever it is that these urban centres are being created?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and many people and policymakers indeed are rightly wary of density. Look, the biggest thing about density is actually you can have very high densities and very, very functional, elegant, beautiful, enjoyable, livable cities. I mean, you look at places like Barcelona, for example, or Paris, right? And they rarely go above 4 stories. But they have very unique approaches to what's called block ratio. So block ratio is the amount of density that you get from a set area, from say, a quarter acre block or something like that. You can go super high, super narrow. You could do courtyard developments. You can do terraces. There's all sorts of different ways of doing it. So achieving density, in a sense, is more about achieving density in a way that people will accept density. If you give people this kind of dystopian density, these sort of faceless high-rises, and every building looks the same, and they will not be as enthusiastic about living in that sort of an area, and that will drive down livability. But if you can achieve density with a combination of beauty, architecture, green space, human scale, street living, activation, all of that, then you can have quite high densities. I mean, look at London, for example, 8,000 or 9,000 people per square kilometre. I mean, it goes way up for cities like Tokyo to more like 20,000, but that's a big difference. But then you look at, say, Australian and New Zealand cities, and they're maybe 1,000 people a square kilometre. Is totally different. So if you want to go for that kind of sweet spot of the 5 to 10, it really, in my view, is about form and function and design as much as anything else.
So within the Asia-Pacific region, Tony, what cities are closest to actually getting there, to the 15-minute concept?
Yeah, and there are a few, Oriel. Singapore has taken on the concept very seriously in their master planning, so it's something that they're looking to reorientate towards. And I mean, they're coming off a good basis anyway, because Singapore is very well organized into sort of into neighborhoods as it is. And that's the other thing, just to quickly mention about this, it's not really a 15-minute city. It's more like 15-minute neighborhoods within a much larger city. And that's really the spatial model here. So another good example of that is Shanghai in China. From 2016 onwards, they've been trying to achieve this.